The cardiologist used the phrase, "We need to keep you overnight for observation," at 11:04 on a Thursday morning. My wife used the phrase, "I've already paid for this trip," at 11:47. She left on Friday. I lay in a hospital bed and thought about all the things I put in her name over 14 years, and all the things I quietly, methodically kept in mind. By the time she landed, I had made 3 phone calls. By the time she came home, the answer to every financial question she thought she knew had changed in a very specific and permanent way. Most men don't know what they're made of until something tries to stop their heart. Not figuratively, literally. Until machine is printing out a strip of paper with your heartbeat on it, and a doctor you met 40 minutes ago is looking at it the way a mechanic looks at an engine he wasn't expecting to find in that condition. Quiet, careful, not rushing to tell you anything, which is somehow worse than if he'd rushed. I know what I'm made of now. I found out on a Thursday in March, in a hospital room in Knoxville, Tennessee, with a needle in my arm and a wife who had a flight to catch. My name is Gerald Mack. I am 64 years old. I live in a house on Ridgemont Way in Knoxville, Tennessee, that I designed a layout of myself on graph paper in 1997 and hired a contractor to build because my knees were already arguing with me about getting on rooftops. I started a small logistics consulting firm in 2003. Nothing flashy, nothing that would make the business section of the paper, and I have been running it quietly and profitably for the last 21 years. I drive a 2016 GMC Sierra in dark green, which I keep clean the way I keep most things, consistently, without making production of it. I coach nothing. I mentor a young man named Darius for my church, which I count as the most useful thing I do on any given week. I am not a complicated man. I have always believed that complicated is usually just another word for dishonest about what you actually want. Welcome to Dad's Raw Revenge. Get comfortable, because this one is going to take you somewhere. Drop a comment, and let me know where you're watching from. Hit that like button, and make sure you're subscribed. Trust me, you're going to love it here. Let me back up. My wife's name is Teresa. We have been married for 14 years. She is 51 years old, which I mention not as a criticism, but as a context. She is a woman who still considers herself young enough to be building her social life rather than settling into it. And she runs her social life the way some people run a campaign, strategically, with advanced planning and a guest list. She is not a cruel woman. I want to say that clearly and mean it. She is not mean by design. She is simply a woman who organized her world into things that matter to her and things that don't, and somewhere along the way, I couldn't tell you exactly when, I moved from the first category into the second. These things happen in marriages the way rust happens on old iron. Slowly then everywhere. She had been planning the Miami trip since January. A long weekend with 4 of her friends, Kara, Michelle, a woman named Denise who I had met twice, and a 4th I had never met and couldn't name if pressed. They had a hotel on Collins Avenue booked. They had a dinner reservation at a restaurant I was informed had a 3-month wait list. Teresa had bought 2 new swimsuits in February and a pair of sandals that cost more than my first truck payment. The trip was on the calendar. It was a fact. It was not a variable. I will tell you this about myself. I am not a man who makes demands. I had not said a single word about the Miami trip. Not about the cost. Not about the timing. Not about the fact that in 14 years of marriage my wife and I had not once taken a trip together that required a hotel on a beach. I had not said a word. I had simply noted these things quietly and filed them in the part of my mind where I store information that doesn't require an immediate response. That part of my mind is very organized. The chest pressure started on a Wednesday afternoon. Not dramatic. I want to be clear about that because I am aware of how these things get described after fact, and I don't want to exaggerate. It wasn't crushing. It wasn't the Hollywood version with a man clutching his lapels. It was more like something sitting on my sternum that had no business being there. Heavy, specific, the kind of sensation that doesn't go away when you shift in your chair. I finished what I was doing. I made a note to call my doctor in the morning. That is a decision I would not make again. Thursday, March 6, 7:14 in the morning. I drove myself to Tenova Medical Center on Middlebrook Pike because the pressure was still there. and because I am 64 years old, and because Harold from my Thursday morning breakfast group had dismissed similar symptoms 3 years ago, and his family eulogized him in October that same year. I signed myself in at the front desk. I sat in the waiting room for 11 minutes, which is either fast or slow, depending on what's sitting on your sternum. The intake nurse was a young woman named Priya who had the specific efficient warmth of a person who has learned to care about everyone without becoming undone by any of them, which is a skill I have come to respect enormously. She got my blood pressure, 157/94, higher than it should be, and walked me back to a room. The cardiologist on call was Dr. Marcus Webb, 40-something, wire-rimmed glasses. The unhurried manner of a man who has learned that rushing the delivery of information rarely improves how it's received. He introduced himself, shook my hand, asked me for questions before he looked at anything else. I appreciated that. He wanted to know what I was experiencing before he looked at what the machines were going to tell him, which suggested he understood the difference between a reading and a patient. He ran an EKG at 9:47 in the morning. He drew blood at 10:02. He came back to my room at 10:58, sat down across from me in the vinyl chair and said, "Mr. Mack, I want to keep you overnight for observation. Your enzyme levels are elevated, and the EKG shows some changes I'd like to monitor." I looked at him. "Is it a heart attack?" "Not a full event. But your heart was working harder than it should have been, and I want to understand why before I send you home." I nodded. "All right." He gave me more information. I listened carefully. I asked 3 specific questions, which he answered without hedging, which I appreciated. By the time he left the room, it was 11:04 in the morning. I lay there for a moment, looking at the ceiling tile directly above my bed. Institutional white, the kind of white that has been repainted so many times it's lost the thread of what it was originally trying to be, and I thought about the logistics of what came next, not the medical part. Dr. Webb had that handled. The other part. I picked up my phone at 11:09 and called Teresa. She picked up on the 4th ring. "Hey, what's up?" "I'm in the middle of packing." "I'm at 10 Nova. I said, "Cardiologist wants to keep me overnight. Something with my enzyme levels." A pause. Shorter than it should have been. "Overnight?" "Gerald, I have a flight tomorrow morning." "I know. Are you okay?" "They don't know yet. That's why they want to keep me." Another pause. I could hear something in the background. A zipper. She was still packing. "Gerald, I've had this trip planned since January. Kara and Michelle are all ready. I know when you planned it. I've already paid for everything. The hotel is non-refundable. I want to be honest with you about what I felt in that moment, because I think honesty is the only thing that makes a story worth telling. I did not feel rage. I know that's what you might expect. A man lying in a hospital bed with elevated cardiac enzymes while his wife audits her travel itinerary. But what I actually felt was much quieter than rage. Something that had been accumulating for a very long time simply finished accumulating. It settled, like sediment, like everything that had been suspended in the water of our marriage finally reaching the bottom. "Okay," I said. "Are you sure you're—" "I'm fine, Teresa. Have a good trip." I hung up at 11:19. I lay there for a while after that. The monitor beside my bed made a small rhythmic sound. Someone in the hallway was pushing a cart with a squeaky wheel. Outside the window, a dogwood tree was doing its best with a March light, which is a pale and unconvincing light, but the dogwood was committed. She called back at 11:47. I let it ring. She sent a text at 12:03 that said, "I hope you feel better. I'll check in when we land." I read it and set the phone face down on the bedside table. There are things you know about a marriage that you don't say out loud, because saying them out loud requires you to do something about them. And some men spend a very long time not being ready to do something about them. I had been one of those men. Not weak. I want to be careful about that distinction. But unready. There is a difference between avoiding a truth and not yet knowing what to do with it. I had known the truth for a while. What I hadn't known until 11:04 on a Thursday morning in a hospital room in Knoxville was that I was finally ready. If you have been listening for a while, do us one quick favor. Subscribe. A lot of people watch without ever doing it, but it costs you nothing, and it means everything to us. Hit the like button while you're at it, and drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to tell you about the business, because it matters to everything that comes after. In 2003, I started Ridgemont Logistics, consulting with $47,000 of my own money, savings from 11 years of working for a larger firm. Money I had set aside in an account that predated my marriage to Teresa by 4 years. The business grew slowly, the way real things grow. And by 2009, it was profitable. And by 2014, it was something I was quietly proud of. Teresa knew I had a consulting business. She knew it paid the mortgage and funded the life we lived. She did not know, because she had never asked what the business was actually worth. She had never asked to see a tax return. She had never asked what the accounts held, or how the structure was organized, or whose name appeared on what. This was not a secret I kept from her. It was information she had never sought. There is a meaningful difference. I had a business attorney named Roy Greer. Roy Greer, Greer & Associates, Knoxville, Tennessee, 27 years in business and contract law. He had done my incorporation, my annual filings, a contract dispute in 2018, and a quiet restructuring in 2021 that I had undertaken for reasons that had nothing to do with Teresa and everything to do with protecting what I had built from general liability exposure. Roy was not a dramatic man. He was a precise one, which is what I had always needed him to be. I called Roy at 12:17 in the afternoon from my hospital bed. "Roy," I said, "I need to understand something." Gerald, he had a voice like old oak, dry, steady, completely unhurried. "Where you calling from?" "Sounds echoey." "Hospital room." "I'm fine. Nothing urgent on the medical end. But I've had some clarity this morning, and I want to talk through the structure." A pause. The professional kind, where a man is recalibrating his afternoon. "All right, talk." We spoke for 31 minutes. I will not reproduce every detail of that conversation, because some of it was technical, and most of it was, by the end, unnecessary to explain. What matters is this. Roy walked me through the current structure of Ridgemont Logistics, consulting with the specific patience of a man who has explained these things before and understand that clarity costs nothing extra. He confirmed what I had already known, but wanted to hear stated plainly. The business was mine. It had always been mine. It was structured as a single-member LLC with a buy-sell provision and an operating agreement that I had signed as sole member in 2003 and updated in 2021. Teresa's name appeared nowhere in the business documents. Not as an officer, not as a member, not as a beneficiary, in the event of a divorce. And neither Roy nor I used that word on that phone call. Not once. Though we both understood what the conversation was about. The business valuation would be a point of contention, but the structure would significantly complicate any claim on the operating assets. "What's the current valuation?" I asked. Roy named a number. I will tell you it was specific and odd, the way real numbers always are, and I will tell you it was considerably higher than anything Teresa had ever imagined I possessed. "What do I need to do?" I asked. Roy was quiet for a moment. "Right now? Nothing. The structure is clean. What I'd recommend is that we update your personal estate documents to reflect current intent, and that we put some things in writing about your personal accounts." "How soon can we do that?" "I can have draft documents to you by Tuesday," he said. "Gerald, are you sure you're all right? You're calling me from a hospital room." "I'm clearer than I've been in about 4 years," I said. "That's all." He was quiet for a beat. "Then, Tuesday morning, I'll have everything ready." I thanked him, set the phone down, and looked out the window at the dogwood. My second call was to Darius. Darius Webb, no relation to the doctor, is 31 years old. He has been in my life since he was 22, when his mother, a woman from my church named Lorraine, asked me if I'd be willing to sit with him after he lost his father unexpectedly. I sat with him. I kept sitting with him. He works in commercial real estate now and is very good at it, and he is one of 3 or 4 people on this earth I would call without calculating whether it was convenient. He picked up on the second ring. "Gerald, everything okay?" "I'm in the hospital." "I'm fine. Cardiac observation. Nothing they're calling a full event. I need a favor." "Name it." "Come sit with me tonight. I don't need anything done. I just need someone in the room." Not a pause. "I'll be there by 6. He was there at 5:47. He brought 2 sandwiches from a deli on Market Street and a thermos of actual coffee, because he had learned early that hospital coffee was not worth the cup it came in. He sat in the vinyl chair across from my bed, ate his sandwich, and let me talk for a while without filling in my pauses, which is a skill most people never develop, and which I have always considered one of the markers of a genuinely useful human being. I told him some of what had happened. Not all of it. I am a private man, and the financial details were not his to carry. But enough. The call at 11:04. The conversation at 11:47. The packing sounds in the background. He listened. He finished his sandwich. He looked at me across the room. "What are you going to do?" he said. "Wait," I said. "Let her land. Let her have her trip. Let everything be exactly as it is for right now." I picked up my coffee. "And then let Roy Greer do what Roy Greer does." Darius looked at me for a moment. He had the expression he sometimes gets when I say something he is deciding whether to question. He decided not to. "Okay," he said. "Then that's what we're doing." We watched a basketball game on the small television, mounted in the corner with the sound low. He left at 10:30 when the nurse reminded him that visiting hours had technically ended 40 minutes earlier and that she had been ignoring this as a professional courtesy. He shook my hand at the door. I told him not to tell anyone where I was. He said he wouldn't. I slept better than I had in years. I don't know exactly why. Maybe because something that had been unresolved was now, in the deepest and quietest part of me, resolved. Dr. Webb came in at 7:22 the next morning, looked at my overnight readings, and sat down with that same unhurried manner. "Good news," he said. "Your enzyme levels have normalized. We don't see evidence of a full infarction. What you likely experienced was a serious warning. Your heart telling you something needed to change." He looked at me directly. "Diet, stress, sleep, all 3. "I'm working on the stress," I said. He studied me for a moment. Then he almost smiled. "All right. I won't see you in my office in 2 weeks. I'm going to prescribe a low-dose statin, and I want you to do a stress test before you leave today. If that comes back clean, you go home this afternoon." The stress test was at 10:15. It came back clean at 11:40. I was discharged at 1:07 in the afternoon on a Friday, which was the same Friday Teresa's flight touched down in Miami at 2:34. I know the landing time because she sent a text. "Landed, 82 degrees. Hope you're resting." 3 sentences. An exclamation point on the weather. I drove home in the Sierra. I made a pot of coffee. I sat at the kitchen table and looked at the room I had lived in for 26 years, the walls I had chosen to paint for, the table my father had made with his hands and given me when I moved into my first house, the window over the sink that looked out onto the backyard, where the oak tree I planted in 2001 was now taller than the house. I sat there for a long time. Roy Greer sent the draft documents on Tuesday morning. As promised, he is a man who does what he says he will do on the timeline. He says he will do it, which is rarer than it should be, and which is the entire reason I have used him for 19 years. I reviewed them that afternoon. I made 3 small notations in the margins, called Roy, discussed them for 18 minutes. He said he'd have the final versions by Thursday. Teresa came home Sunday evening. She came through the door at 6:44 with a rolling suitcase and a tote bag and a sun-warmed energy that people carry when they've had several days of exactly what they wanted. She looked rested. She looked, in a specific way I noted without judgment, like a woman who had not spent significant emotional energy worrying about anyone but herself. "Hey," she said, "how are you feeling? You look better." "I'm better," I said. "Good trip?" "Amazing. The weather was perfect. We did a boat thing on Saturday. I sent you pictures." "I saw." She set her bag down, looked around the kitchen. "Have you eaten? I can make something." "I ate," I said. She poured herself a glass of water, leaned against the counter. "So what did the doctor say? Is everything okay?" "Warning event," I said. "Nothing structural. He wants me to see him in 2 weeks." "Good." She nodded, took a sip of water. "Scary, though. I'm glad it wasn't worse." I looked at my wife across the kitchen. She was tan and rested, and she meant what she just said. I believe that. And she also had spent 4 days in Miami while I lay in a hospital bed, which was also true, and both of these things occupied the same space without canceling each other out. Teresa, I said, I want to talk to you about some things. Not tonight. I'm tired. But this week. She looked at me carefully. Something in my tone had registered. Okay, she said. Of course. Good. I said, get some rest. I signed Roy's final documents on Thursday, March 13th at 2:30 in the afternoon. Roy walked me through each page with the deliberate pace of a man who wants you to understand exactly what you are signing and why. The estate update was a central document. It restructured the beneficiary designations on my personal accounts, revised the language around the business in the event of divorce proceedings, and made specific and irrevocable certain transfers I have been considering for 2 years and had now, with considerable clarity, decided to execute. I want to tell you about one of those transfers, because it matters. I have a younger sister named Claudette. She is 58 years old, and she lives in Knoxville 3 miles from me, and she is one of the finest people I have ever had the privilege of knowing. She raised 2 sons alone after her husband left in 2009, worked as a school administrator for 24 years, and never once asked me for a single thing, which is a hallmark of a Mac. We handle our own. We do not announce our struggles. We simply keep going. I had been meaning, for years, to do something concrete for Claudette. I had been meaning it the way people mean things when they haven't quite found a moment that turns intention into action. I had $87,400 in a personal account that I had not touched in 3 years and had no specific plan for. Roy drafted the transfer paperwork. It went to a new account in Claudette's name, to be released to her on her 60th birthday, in 18 months, with a letter I wrote myself, which I will not reproduce here, because it was for her and not for anyone else. I told her on a Sunday afternoon in late March. I drove to her house, sat at her kitchen table, drank her coffee, and told her what was coming and when. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, Gerald Raymond Mack, which is the only situation in which she uses my middle name. You did not have to do this. I know, I said. That's why I did it. She shook her head, looked at the window, looked back at me. What does Teresa say? She doesn't know yet, I said. Some of what I've been doing. She's going to learn about in a different context. Claudette studied me for a long moment with the specific calm of a woman who is weathered enough to read a room without having to be told what's in it. Then she said, okay, and got up and refilled my coffee. And we talked about our boys for an hour, and neither of us mentioned Teresa again that afternoon. The conversation with Teresa happened on a Wednesday evening in the last week of March. I had asked her to sit down. I had made dinner, the same pot roast I make when something needs to be said, which Teresa didn't know was a ritual, and which maybe wasn't one for her the way it was for me, but which mattered to me nevertheless. We ate. I let her finish. Then I set 3 things on the table between us. Roy Greer's summary letter, which outlined in plain language the current structure of Ridgemont Logistics, Consulting, and what that structure meant in practical terms. A copy of the updated estate documents. Cover page only. I was not going to walk her through every clause, but I was not going to be opaque either. And a single page I had written myself, not a letter, just a list of the specific moments over 14 years that had brought me to this table with these documents. The call at 11:09. The packing sounds. I've already paid for everything. The 4 missed calls I had not returned. I'll check in when we land. The exclamation point on the weather. She read the list first. I watched her face the way you watch something in a still pond, waiting to see what breaks the surface. She looked up at me. Her composure was intact. She was never a woman who fell apart easily, which was something I had always respected about her, and which now felt like a kind of distance. I didn't know the business was worth that, she said. You never asked, I said, not unkindly, just accurately. She looked at the cover page of the estate documents. You changed everything while I was in Miami. I changed everything while I was in a hospital room. I said, you were in Miami. That landed. I watched it land. She was quiet for a long time. Outside, the oak tree in the backyard was moving in a slow evening wind, and the kitchen light was doing what kitchen light does at that hour, making everything look both warm and a little worn, the way things look when you've been in the same place long enough to stop seeing them clearly and then suddenly start again. Gerald, she said, and her voice had shifted. Not broken. Shifted. The specific register of a person who has understood something she cannot take back. What do you want to happen now? I thought about that. I thought about 14 years. About the way a marriage can hold two people in separate directions for a very long time and call it partnership. About the hospital ceiling tile and Dr. Webb's unhurried manner, and Darius in the vinyl chair at 547 with 2 sandwiches and actual coffee. I want to be honest, I said. For the first time in a while, I want to be completely honest with both of us. She nodded slowly. Okay, I don't want to blow anything up, I said. I'm not a man who blows things up, but I am also not going to go back to being a man who lies in a hospital bed and gets a text about the weather. The room was very quiet. We can figure out what comes next, I said, but it's going to be figured out honestly, and it's going to be figured out understanding what things actually are. I stood up. I cleared the dishes, the same way I always clear the dishes. I rinsed them, stacked them in the drying rack, turned off the kitchen light. I'm going to sit on the porch, I said. Take your time in here. I went out through the back door and sat in a chair I have sat in on that porch since 2001, the one that faces the oak tree. The March air was cold and clean. The oak tree was doing what it always did, standing there rooted, taking the wind without argument, having simply grown too large to be moved by things that used to move it. I sat there for a long time. I made no decisions that night. I did not call anyone. I did not feel triumphant or vindicated, or any of the things people expect a man to feel when something finally breaks in the direction he needed it to break. What I felt was quieter than any of that, simpler. I felt like a man who had told the truth and was going to be all right. It has been 4 months since that Wednesday evening. I will tell you, plainly and without exaggeration, how things stand. Teresa and I are in the process of separating, which is not a word I use dramatically, but practically. 2 adults being honest about what a marriage became and deciding what to do about it. Roy Greer is handling my end of the paperwork. There is another attorney handling hers. The conversations have been, by and large, what they need to be. Not warm, not cold, honest. Ridgemont Logistics Consulting is mine. It has always been mine. Roy's 2021 restructuring, which I had executed for reasons that had nothing to do with Teresa, turned out to be the most consequential piece of work he ever did for me. Claudette does not know the full story of the separation yet. She will when it's complete. She made me pot roast last week, and we sat at her kitchen table the way we have sat at kitchen tables our whole lives, and she told me about her son Marcus's new job and her son Jerome's new apartment, and she did not ask me about anything I wasn't ready to tell her. She is, as I have always known her to be, one of the finest people I have ever had the privilege of knowing. I saw Dr. Marcus Webb for my 2-week follow-up on March 20th, and for my 6-week follow-up in April, and I am scheduled to see him again in July. My blood pressure is 131/82. My enzyme levels are normal. He told me at the April appointment that I looked like a man who had reduced his stress load, and I told him he was correct. And he said good and wrote something in my chart and shook my hand. The stress test came back clean. All of it. There's a thing about warnings that most people misunderstand. They think a warning means you were lucky. What a warning actually means is that your body understood something before your mind was ready to act on it. It gave you the information early, while there was still time. The question is always whether you're going to use it. I used it. A hospital room and 3 phone calls. A man who brought sandwiches and actual coffee. And a business she never asked about because she never thought she needed to. What would you have done? Lie in that bed at 11:04 in the morning, listening to packing sounds in the background? Drop it in the comments. I read everyone. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button and subscribe for more real, raw, and family stories. I will see you on the next one.